everyone. Sorry to make you wait. As Mary said, I'm going to be talking about why success isn't repeatable. But I'm going to talk about how you can gain wisdom and still succeed, even though success isn't intrinsically repeatable. But I want to start with a question, actually. I get my clicker. I want to start with a question. I'd like everyone to think, just in their heads, you don't have to tell me out loud, what's your favorite best practice? What thing do you always like to do with your teams? Maybe you make sure your web apps have an audit trail built in from day one. Or maybe you like to make sure that your Scrum always has a 2-week sprint. Or maybe you always write the unit tests first. Just have a think about that. And then I have a second question for you, which is, when would that be a bad practice? What scenario would make that a bad idea? What industry, what product, what set of stakeholders, what customer, what people in your team would mean that best practice turned into a bad practice? I'm going to return to that idea later on, but first I want to talk a little bit about learning. There we go. Learning is something I'm very, very passionate about, actually. I think it's maybe one of my biggest passions. Certainly in work, I think I'm always learning. I think we as developers and as leaders have to be learning about our customers and what they need and about our market. It's actually built into the Agile Manifesto that we're going to be responsive to changing requirements, I think is how it's framed, which really means learning about the reason for what we're building. And as leaders, we're often thinking about learning for the people in our teams. For me, it's definitely infected my hobbies as well. I really like quizzes, hence some of these pictures up here. And quizzes are a very unusual and quite specific form of learning. Quizzes are really about knowledge, being able to kind of produce it on demand and answer questions and kind of retain those ideas. And I also really like games. I like games a lot. I think games are an excellent example of learning because every single game you play, you have to learn the rules. You then have to learn how to apply the rules and how to actually play the game if you want to put the rules into practice. And then hopefully you also learn how to be good at the game and how to win. And one of the reasons I like games in particular is because they are responsive. When you're playing a game, the way that you win is going to be different every time. You need to be thinking about your competitors and what they're doing, anticipating their actions, strategizing about them. Because in a game, success isn't repeatable. And I think it's the same in leadership. I think in leadership, we're thinking about our organizations, about our teams, and how to make them succeed. And I think success isn't repeatable there either. Now, I do know that sometimes when I compare leading an organization to playing a game, something so important as leading an organization, people like to tell me that I don't take my job seriously enough. And I guess I would like to question back to you whether you're taking your board games seriously enough. I think learning matters a lot in technology in particular, and I think that's partly because there's always something new beyond us. We're always aware of the next technology and all the benefits it could bring. So if you think about a typical web stack that you might be using today, you might have a front end written in React. Oh, I'm going to get some of these logos wrong. You might be using React with TypeScript in your front end. Maybe that's accessing an API in GraphQL, which is going with an application served via Nginx that's written in Python using Django, and maybe your data store is Postgres, all of which is containerized using Docker and then orchestrated with Kubernetes. That's not an uncommon kind of web stack to use. 10 years ago, half of these technologies didn't exist. And if you're looking at the 2012 for TypeScript, it was released in October of that year, so it is just outside that 10-year window, I checked. What that means is, for a lot of your developers, these things were released when they were in the middle of their careers. So if you want to adopt these kinds of technologies, your team is going to have to learn them while they're working. It's not the job of education, the education phase of people's lives, to learn these technologies. It's going to become part of their work. At the same time, we've had this big, I think, excellent phenomenon in our industry of the rise of the non-traditional dev. People for whom software development is a job first, rather than being a hobby first. I think back in the day, it used to be that developers were the people who wrote code for fun and then discovered that they could get paid for it. And now it's sort of the other way around, that people discover they can get paid for it and then discover second that it's actually quite fun as well. This has been an excellent thing. It's brought lots of diversity of thought, of background, and just lots of brilliant new people into our industry, and I think we're all the richer for it. But these are folks who are going to expect learning to be part of their work because they're not doing code as a hobby. And so we need to enable that. As leaders, we have to have learning that means that we can use the technologies that we want to use, and we have to be bringing along people who aren't coding for fun in their spare time. So then the question is, how can we make learning that achieves that? I'm going to talk about two frameworks that I think are useful for thinking about that, and then I'll talk about some things that don't work and some other things that do, and then something that I think binds them all together. So one very useful model is this one. It's called Bloom's taxonomy, technically Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive learning. It is a way of classifying the level of outcome of learning. So right at the bottom, we have the idea of knowing something. You might know a fact. You might then understand that thing, then being able to apply that, being able to analyze a situation where that's been applied, being able to evaluate something that's been done with that, and then being able to create something new. To try and bring this to life, I'm going to give an example. I'm going to use the example of a closure. Some of you will have come across this idea before, some of you won't. I'm aware that JavaScript is a slightly controversial language. I know that some of you will not like JavaScript, and I'm sorry for that. This is written in JavaScript. I know that some of you will really like JavaScript, and I know that this is written in bad old JavaScript, and I'm sorry for that as well. I just think it's slightly clearer in old JavaScript, honestly. So the idea in a closure is that we have a function that returns another function. A closure is a function that can see its lexical scope. So it can see variables near where the function was defined rather than where the function is used. So here we have this function counter. Counter returns a function, but it also initializes a variable called count to 0. And the function it returns is going to add 1 to count and then return its new value. If we call counter, what we get back is a function which we can call. The first time we call it, it's going to add 1 to count, so we get 1, that gets returned. If we call it again, it's going to add another 1 to count, which is 2, and that value gets returned. If we call counter again, this version of counter, this second variable, has its own scope. So when it's called, it has its own variable of count that it can see, and that's going to go up to 1 and return it. But if we go back to the first counter we had, that's not forgotten its value of count, and so it's gone up to 3 now. So to apply Bloom's taxonomy to this, you might know what a closure is. You might understand what a closure is. You might then say, I can apply that and write a closure. You might be able to analyze the situation and say, this would be a great place to write a closure. You might be able to evaluate something and say, you've written an excellent closure here. And then you might be able to do something creative. You might say, I haven't seen this done before, but I could probably solve this problem with a closure inside another closure. There's a problem here, though. Bloom's taxonomy doesn't tell me how to learn something. It doesn't tell me how to get further up that pyramid towards better results. One thing that does help with that is this model called ICAP, ICAP from these 4 initials. And ICAP is really about the inputs to learning. I'm going to start from the bottom and work up. The idea here is that passive learning, consuming content effectively, reading a book, watching a video, that definitely is learning, but you will get better results if you do active learning. Active learning means interacting with the learning materials in some way. So maybe while you're watching the video, you're taking notes, or while you're reading the book, you're underlining things or highlighting them. A layer above that is constructive learning. If while learning you're building something, doing something generative, you will get better learning results as a result of that. And then at the very top is interactive learning. This is specifically interaction with another human. So interactive learning means we're building something and then we talk about it, we discuss it. I like this model because I think it probably fits everyone's intuition very well. I think we've all had conversations with other people about building things, and we've learned from them by having that conversation. And I think we've probably all had the experience where we've read a book, we've watched a video, and then we've come to try and put that thing into practice, and we've discovered that there was still a lot of the learning left to go. That would be, we've started with passive learning and realized that we need constructive learning to get the best kind of outcomes. What this model doesn't tell me is how it relates to the level of outcome. If you think about the very top of that Bloom's taxonomy pyramid that evaluate and create levels of outcome, can I get there with just passive learning? Does it just take longer, or can I maybe I just can't get there at all? It doesn't tell you. I'm going to talk more about that in a second, but first I want to talk about part of the process of getting there, and specifically one hard falsehood about that process, and one hard, inescapable truth. So let's talk about learning styles. Learning styles is this very compelling idea that people prefer to learn in certain ways and that we should help them learn in those ways. So if you are a visual learner, then you might learn best by watching a video. If you're someone who prefers reading, then you might learn best by reading a book. It makes a lot of sense. It is unfortunately not true. It's a really compelling idea, it's intuitive. Unfortunately, all of the evidence is that matching the way that you deliver learning to someone's preference doesn't make you learn faster, and it doesn't improve the level of outcome either. It is a myth, but a tenacious one. One thing that's very true, though, is that boredom is the opposite of learning. If you are bored, you aren't learning. This is another, I think, intuitive idea, but this one is backed by a theory. It's called the affective context model. And in the affective context model, the way we learn is by attaching emotions and feelings to the things we're learning. That's why we retain them, because of those things being attached. And boredom is really the absence of strong emotions or feelings. And so if you're bored and you aren't experiencing those emotions or feelings, then you're not going to be learning. I think if you feel bored while learning, then I would say probably you're not learning at all, you're just simply bored. So I want to talk about a new model that I think bridges the inputs of learning and the outcomes of learning. And it's a relatively simple one. It's called knowledge, skills, and wisdom. And the idea is that these are three different kinds of thing to be learned, and that we should treat them differently as a result of that. We should think about them differently, and we should expect different kinds of results. So knowledge is things like data, it's facts, it's information, something that you could write down and give to someone. A layer above that is skills. Skills are doing things, they're abilities, things that you're able to do. And then wisdom is about contextual judgment. It's about being in a situation and making good decisions based on the situation that you're in. I mentioned that I like board games. This is a photo of a board game called Catan that some of you might have played. Anyone want to put their hand up and own up to playing Catan? Oh, loads of people. Amazing. Okay, so when you're learning a board game, there is knowledge. There's knowledge in terms of the rules of Catan. So if you read the rules of Catan, you'll discover that this piece is called the robber, and the robber is a bad piece for you because when you want to get resources, the robber will prevent you. But you can roll a 7 on your turn, and if you do that, you get to move the robber, steal a resource from someone else, and that's good for you and bad for them. The skill in board game comes into putting those things into practice. So knowing the rules isn't really sufficient to be able to play the game intelligently or well. That's where the skill comes in. And then wisdom is about making the right decisions based on where the game is now. So it might be, where am I going to move the robber to? Which other player is doing well? What resources do they need? And how can I move the robber to make their chance of winning that much harder? If that knowledge, skills, and wisdom model maps quite neatly onto Bloom's taxonomy. So at the bottom levels, knowing and understanding, those are about knowledge. Being able to apply and analyze, those are really about skills, which I would argue are a very different thing to knowledge. And then being able to evaluate and create new things are about having wisdom. And like Bloom's taxonomy, knowledge, skills, and wisdom build on each other. We typically need wisdom to apply skills intelligently, and in order to apply skills, there is often required knowledge behind that. So how do we relate that back to the inputs of ICAP? Well, I just told you some things about the rules of Catan, and you probably remember what this piece was called, and you might also remember what number you have to roll in order to move that piece. And you didn't have to do anything to gain that knowledge except listen to me ramble on slightly about the rules of a board game that most of you have actually played, so you may have already known those rules. You can gain knowledge passively. You can gain knowledge by absorption, by osmosis. And actually, you would have learned those things slightly better if you had been making notes while I was talking. You're like, oh, 7, robber, got it. You would have learned those things better if you'd done active learning. But none of those things make you able to play the game. So passive and active learning are really about ways of learning knowledge. If you want skill, if you want to be able to play the game of Catan, then you need to go and play it. Skills are gained by doing, and that's the constructive part of the ICAP model. Wisdom, I'm going to come back to in a little bit. First, I should say I'm aware that this conference is not called the Lead Board Gamer, although if they do decide to run that, I will attend. If we apply those ideas to something in the world of technology, like the open-closed principle, then knowledge would be knowing what that principle is, knowing that it's about, I'm obviously going to butcher this now, knowing that it's about having modules that are designed so that they can be extended without you having to edit their code. Knowing and understanding that principle is the knowledge component. And then the skill comes into putting that into practice, being able to write code that is in line with the principle. And then wisdom might be looking at other people's code and seeing if they have written code in line with the principle in the right kind of way, and sometimes deciding to totally ignore the principle at all. That is part of wisdom, is knowing when to apply things and when to not. I want to end, for the last third of this talk about wisdom, how we learn it, how we try to learn it, and how we fail, and what we can do instead. And I talked earlier about knowledge, skills, and wisdom as separate things. And one of the things, a phenomenon that I've noticed, is that we very often try and turn wisdom back into knowledge, which I think makes a lot of sense, because wisdom is hard to pass on and knowledge is easy to pass on. But unfortunately, I'm not convinced that it works. What happens is someone wise who has experience and understands the reasoning behind their experience tries to condense it down into a form that the rest of us can take on and learn. So that happens in common phrases, idioms, like these kinds of things are often passed on from people who are wise to people who are at least perceived as less wise, because wisdom is hard to pass on. But when we do this, we end up with answers, but not the context where those answers were right, which can mean that they're the wrong answers for us. And this happens in technology too. I did some asking around, and I got some examples of situations where people had seen wisdom misapplied and sometimes with disastrous results. So very conservative organizations that had a, let's say, aggressive posture towards things like security and defense which try to adopt a move fast and break things culture. Would not end well. Smaller organizations that try and use the right tool for the right job every single time and end up supporting more languages than they have people in their staff. Tiny companies of 4 developers that adopt the Spotify model for organizing people because it works for Spotify. People talking about doing Scrum ceremonies simply because that's just what you do, not thinking about the reasoning behind them, which certainly exists, and there's a lot you can read on that. But if you're just doing them, then you might be doing them wrong, and you might not need to do them at all. And then my favorite one is 2 pizza teams. This was a story from an Indian entrepreneur who was writing that his investors had said, your hiring plans are much too big. We need to cut this team down to size. Look at successful companies. Look at Amazon. They have this policy of 2 pizza teams. Your team is way too big for that. What this investor didn't realize is that in India, pizzas are roughly half the size of pizzas in America, because context matters. And if you ignore that context, you might make the wrong decisions. These are all good pieces of advice, I should say. I'm not saying any of these are wrong. They're good pieces of advice. Sometimes there is a context where they are correct, and there are other contexts where they are wrong. And that's because success is not reliably repeatable. It's actually the same when you play games. If you play a board game and you play the same strategy every time, you're very easy to beat, because the context in a game matters a lot as well. There's actually an idea in games of a broken game. In a broken game, there's only really one sensible way to play it. There's one strategy that makes sense to play, because it's the one that will get you the best possible results every time. And in a game that's broken, the winner is effectively determined by whoever gets to play first. The good news is that reality, leadership, software engineering, economics, these are not broken games. There is not a single solution that solves every single problem. The success is contextual. So that means we need to find a way of learning wisdom. The way that we do that, the way that we gain wisdom, is around this cycle where we try things, we fail or succeed. Success is also an option. And then we reflect. And that reflection part is really key to learning wisdom, because wisdom is about understanding why we succeeded or we failed. What was it about our context that made the things that we did good ideas or bad ideas? And that's how we start to learn what we should do next time, and we start to see the reasoning behind what we do and why our actions make sense or not given a certain situation. The problem is that this loop can be very, very long. If you think about architecturing an application, it might be multiple years before you realize that you made a bad decision early on, and it's actually a very big bad decision. Around 2014, started working on a web application where I was the first developer on the application. And it was about students applying to universities. And so a really key part of the data model was a student's application to a university. And I called that model application. And by the time, thank you, yes, it's obvious now. Application came to mean the web app itself. It came to mean that part of the that data model. It's also in the framework we were using. It's a kind of core class from which many other things are, a base class from many other things that are derived from. It became a status on the user's journey through the platform. And we realized the thing that I had called application actually really needed a better name, and there was something else that would have better been called application instead. That was 8 years ago. My understanding is that there are 4 people from that company who are here. I want to apologize to you. I'm not sure if that problem is fixed yet, and I am, sorry that I caused it. There are 2 ways of accelerating this loop. That's the good news. We can gain wisdom faster. The first one is to reflect with peers. Your peers, other people who are solving similar kinds of problems but in different contexts, are a really wonderful way to do this because they have a different context and they may well have different solutions. And by comparing notes about those, you will gain that enlightenment to understand why something works for you and not for them, and vice versa. And you'll start to understand how context is affecting your decisions. Training is also an excellent way to gain this kind of wisdom because training can simulate an environment for you where it sets up a context. It gives you actions to perform, and then you can see what works in what context and what doesn't firsthand in a very fast feedback cycle. I'm just going to end with one final thought, a kind of analogy. So in machine learning, there's this idea of reinforcement learning. And in reinforcement learning, we are taking an AI model, we're giving it an environment to kind of play around in. And the job of the model is to take actions to get the best possible reward that it can. So the AI is being trained to maximize its reward. And in reinforcement learning, there is a constant trade-off between exploration and exploitation. Exploration meaning exploring new ideas, new things that the model could be trying, new parts of the parameter space that it hasn't explored yet, to see if they are a good idea for gaining more reward. Or, the other side of the trade-off, exploitation, taking the learning that we already have in our model and doubling down on that, digging deeper into that part of the parameter space and understanding more about that, learning more about that. And this trade-off is often encapsulated with the variable epsilon. When epsilon is 0, we say that the model is only exploiting what it already knows. It's sticking with its best practices, it's doing the same things that it's already tried, and it's not exploring new parts of the parameter space. On the other hand, when epsilon is 1, all the model is doing is exploring. It's constantly trying things and then throwing away the results. It's never building on them. It's reinventing the wheel every single time. I'm not advocating for either extreme here. I don't think either of those is healthy. But I guess I want to end with a question. How much are you exploring new alternatives? Or to put it another way, is your epsilon where it should be? If you'd like to talk more about models for learning, if you'd like to talk more about board games, certainly, please do come and find me. I'll be in the, gosh, I've forgotten what they call it, the Q&A area upstairs. Mary, you're telling me and I can't. Office hours, thank you. I'll be up in the office hours and then I'll be on the Skillaware stand. Please do come and find me and talk to me. You'll remember that we have a code challenge. You absolutely should try it. It's super fun. Last time I checked, there was only one person who had all 3 criteria met for that challenge. So the game is still on. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.